Hi YouTube, welcome back to Wtf Rc Cars. So, still round about 2 weeks on from when Team Associated said they were going to send out the missing E-clip and the replacement hubs, but still not received anything yet. But we're going to crack on with the build and hopefully we don't run into any other issues, because at the minute we've got his rear suspension held on with a clip, and I'm not really sure how these things are staying together because they're all shattered. Curiosity got better of me though. I did get one of the parts tree that these come on, same plastic, it's from the injection moulding, and I put a layer of Loctite on it. Left it for 2 or 3 days, not one crack. Tried bending it, didn't crack. So not entirely sure if it's the thread lock that's caused these cracks, or if it is what my initial thought was, where the hole is just not drilled big enough. But only time will tell. So let's bring in for a close-up look and see how far we get. So moving along, we are starting with bag G, and we're going to be building the shock pistons up. And on this you're going to need 8 E-clips. We're going to need the number 2 of the actual shock pistons, and make sure you remove all the tabs, and it is telling you to build these with the number facing upwards. So for each one of these we're first going to have to get one of our little E-clips, and these should be a lot easier to assemble on the shocks than any other part of the RC. So we're going to put one on. So we're going to place the E-clip on first, then one of his pistons, and have the number facing upwards. Not really sure it'll make any difference, but it's the way it's telling us in the manual. Then we're just going to get the E-clip and just clip it on top. Quickly check, make sure it's all the way down so you've got the ends clipped into the little rings. And we're going to build all 4 of these up. The 2 short ones are the front, the 2 longer ones are the rear. And if anybody's curious, this is the bit of plastic that's now had thread lock on it for well over a week. And if I grab this, and even if I try and bend it, I'm not seeing any shattering. So yeah, not sure whether the thread lock actually had anything to do with it. But I'll get these assembled and then we'll crack on. So that is our 4 pistons assembled. Nice and easy, no drama on these. They does feel a very slight bit of play in them, but nothing nothing that would concern me, even if you were going to run this RC. But yep, they're quite nice. So let's carry on, see what else we've got. So for this one, sorry these bits are white on white, but you need one of your clips, then the thinner spacer, an O-ring, thicker spacer, O-ring, and then one of the thinner spacers. And I now know what this tool's for. So we're going to start with the clip on the bottom. Then next we're going to drop on one of our spacers. Then I'm going to get an O-ring, and it does tell you on these to use the shock oil, but for me I prefer this O-ring grease, and especially if it's going to be stood for an extended amount of time on a shelf, I think this O-ring grease will probably seal your shock oil in a little bit better. And so far since I got this, I've not had any of the shocks that I've assembled with this grease leak, which has been nice, because I've had a few different RCs with shocks that leak. But that is the order that we're going to be making this sandwich in. So just to cover it, your flat spacer at the bottom, thin shim, red O-ring, thick spacer, red O-ring, thin spacer or shim. Then we're going to get one of the shock bodies. So it does tell us that we're building all 4 up exactly the same. So at this point, doesn't matter whether you're making a front or a rear. So what it tells you to do is place all this in and then push it until it snaps. And then you should just remove it, and it does sit all the way down in the bottom, and you can see your O-ring is really close to the edge. So I'll get the other 3 assembled and we'll carry on. So moving on, once you've got all the seals assembled, next we're going to assemble the 2 front shocks. And for these, we're just dropping the shorter of the pistons through. And then for your rear, you want 2 of the clear shims or spacers, if you like, on each one of the longer rear shafts. So you need to drop them on, and then we're going to work the shaft through into the actual shock body. And these are just to limit the actual extent of the shocks. So we slide them on and then just carefully work your way through your seals. So we should end up with 4 shocks. Wipe the grease off the bottom of them. So as shocks go, quite enjoyable to build these so far, but let's see what else we've got. So moving on, we've got the O-rings that seal the top of the shock bodies. So you want to carefully work them on, make sure they're all the way down. Then you're going to want to get your shock pliers. And we're going to want the bottoms of the shocks screwing on. And just screw these on until they're snug. Once you've got that assembled, we're then going to get one of the little olives. And we're just going to pop that in. So we should now have a working shock. Them pistons come up quite far on the front ones though. But let's get the other 3 assembled and then we'll crack on. Right, so we should have all 4 shocks assembled. Then all we need to do is get our shock oil. Now it tells you to fill these 3/4 away. And then move the actual piston up and down to get rid of air. And then once all air bubbles have come out, tells you to fill it, and then we're going to leave it to sit to make sure all bubbles are out. So I'll get the other 3 filled and then move on. So for this next step, it's telling you to place a few drops of oil in the cap and on the actual threads. We topped all the shocks up. So it's then telling you to place the shock cap on and tighten them down, and then compress the shock, and if there's any pressure at the top, it's telling you to just back the threads off, push the shock up, and then tighten off the shock, and we should then end up with no pressure. So then you can wipe off all the excess. Make sure the shock's tightened down all the way, and then you should be able to compress the shock without any excess pressure in the top, and that way it should have forced out any of the air or any excess oil. So again, if we just fit it and then just compress it, if there's no excess pressure at the top, then you should just get a little tiny bit of oil come out. But that's all 4 shocks assembled. So let's move on, see what else we've got. So moving along, we have the little collars that we need to put on these shocks. Now, yeah, I've got a slightly bigger hole and a smaller hole on these. So for these, you're just going to want to get your Allen key. Hopefully you have one that fits, and just go careful when you're putting these in when it's initially cutting the threads, because again we're going into this rather brittle clear plastic, and I think it'd be very easy for these to shatter. So as you're screwing these together, it says the front ones gives you a measurement of 6.5mm, but I'm not exactly sure where that's measuring from. But I think for me, I'm just going to leave these all the way to the top, and I will just slightly adjust these once I've got the RC fully assembled and I can see where I want it to sit, but just nip them up. Then we're going to need to get a spring, and then you want one of the bottoms of your shocks. So if we get that into place, we've got a pretty nice nice working shock. So for me, with these collars, it's basically showing you to build them all the same way round. I like to flip them. So if I have one to one side up front, I like the opposite side to face the opposite way. But it's completely down to how you want to build your RC, and if that kind of thing bothers you or not. What I will do on it, I'll tend to have them towards the inside if it makes sense on the RC, but it depends where the shocks sit. But as a rule, I'd tend to have them set like that on the front and matching on the back. But I'll get the rest assembled and see what else we've got. So there we have it, all 4 shocks built up, and I must admit, compared to some of the other parts of the RC, this was a really nice task to do, and compared to building other shocks on other RCs, these are pretty nice to build. They feel really smooth, and nothing's particularly awkward with them. They go together nice, they work nice, and I'm not seeing a single drop of oil coming out of anywhere on them. So yeah, these are definitely one of the most enjoyable parts of this build so far. But let's carry on and see what else we've got. Right, so carrying on with the build, we're going to get us front shock. We've got to put the top bits in place, so we want first as little clear sort of shock mount. Then you're going to lower the bottom into place, and we've got to get this pin with the ring facing backwards. And I must admit, for any of the drawbacks with the clear plastic, it does make tasks like this so much easier, because his next task is to get this tiny little grub screw, an Allen key, and then we've got to line the actual slot up. And then we've got to try and screw this tiny little grub screw in, which is easier said than done because you can barely get the Allen key in there, and this really does feel like this little Allen key is about to give way. You're not going to need to go crazy tight with this. All we're going to do is try and get this little Allen key, little grub screw, to tighten down to the insert in that bar or the little cutout, just so it holds the actual pin. So let's see if I can get this on camera, but the screw that you're going for is there, and then that's your pin where it's going to sit through, and you want it just poking out the back of the arm. So if we try and line it up best we can, and then you're just going to tighten this little grub screw up until it holds the bar down. So I'll get that tightened up and then we'll carry on. So I'm not sure how well it'll show on camera, but that is basically how far you have the sticking out with the little groove there, and then we've got to screw that little grub screw all the way down till it just stops this pin falling out. So that's one, and that's the only way I managed to tighten it up with the pliers, but it's in there, it's held on, and we have one side of the suspension almost finished. So once we've got the grub screw tight, we just need to drop on a washer. And I'm not one bit surprised that these don't actually fit. So it looks like they made the washers too big and they hit the top of the actual shock itself. Both sides of the shock are identical, so it's not going to help flipping that round. But we need to screw this on. And for this, you're going to need a 1/4 nut drive, and I really wouldn't go crazy with this. You just want to nip it down because you've got one of the quite brittle little spacers, but we have working suspension. The washer will force its way onto the top of the shock without too much pressure. It just pokes it up a bit, so they will fit. Just not exact, but then again, that seems to be the theme with this thing. So let's get the other side fastened on. So that is both sides of suspension on, and the more I put this car together, the more I look at it and think, who on earth designed it? You can't use the travel in the suspension because as the arm comes up, the bottom of the shock hits the arm. So yeah, very strange design. So you've literally got half the shock travel as your suspension, but just goes to show how far we've come with design of RC cars. So moving along, we're now getting to the rear shocks, and for these we're going to want one of these longer screws. We're going to want a washer for either side. We're going to want a nut for either side, and then we're going to want one of our spacers, and it is telling you to go for one hole in. So if we put that on, then we get one of our rear shocks. We're then going to have to get it in place. We're going to have to put on another washer, and strangely enough on the rear ones these seem to fit better, so I think it's just the angle that the front shocks are at that makes it a little bit awkward. Then we want our 1/4 inch drive again. And again, because this is the brittle clear plastic, you don't really want to over tighten them at all. Then on the rear, it's telling us to go for 1 hole in. So if we try and line this up, so hopefully you can see it's 1 in from the end, and then we just need to get our Allen key, and luckily I've got some ball end Allen keys on this, because this is a bit of an awkward angle to try and screw them in at. And I think if it wasn't for the ball tip on this, you'd be taking it out and turning it 1/4 of a turn at a time or 1/2 a turn at a time. But again, with these, just screw them in nice and steady. You don't want to overheat the plastic or anything, getting the threads too warm, or else you could shatter your arms. So get this screwed on and see what's next. So there we have it. That's where it screws in. We've got everything in place on the top, and unlike the front, this suspension actually works. You can use the whole travel. So we've just got to do exactly the same on this side, and then we'll have all the shocks on. There we have all the suspension assembled on the RC10 CC. Definitely see some flaws in designs, but then again, RC's come a long way. So let's wrap this one up. So there we have it. We now have an RC10 with suspension. I mean, it's got suspension. I can see a lot of flaws in the design. I don't know how on earth people managed to run these things back in the day. Certainly, it's been an eye-opener building something from this area, especially from Team Associated. We do have 2 other Team Associated RCs, and I think by the time they got to building DR10, they got a bit better at instructions. Didn't get a bit better at putting bits in box that should be in box, but other than that, the instructions of the DR10 was better, and the design of it definitely, Team Associated came a long way. But yeah, it's been an interesting build so far. Some enjoyable bits, some not so enjoyable, like them horrid little grub screws. They're definitely finger killers. But we're carrying on with it. We shall see how far we get, and hopefully before I finish it, Team Associated have sent me out the new knuckles and the missing E-clip. But thanks again for watching Wtf Rc Cars. If you like this kind of content, don't forget to like and subscribe, hit the notification bell, share to friends and family, and catch you guys again in the next one.